All right, so we typically have a second session of financing focused on this one topic, social health insurance. And the reason we do it, it is the most demanded topic in the flagship courses. But it's also the most likely topic for people to get wrong. It has been confused so much because the term social health insurance has existed for a long time and it has changed over time. So different people define it in different ways. The flagship course in the Green Book has a very specific definition of social health insurance, which is the traditional form. But so much has happened over the years that it gets confused by a lot of people. So a big part of what we want to do in this session is lay out the history of social health insurance, the different elements of it, and then I'm going to focus on one dimension of it related to how the money is generated. And I have a very strong view on this one. I share that view with a lot of people much smarter than me, but it's a view. It's a professional position. It may be wrong. And I'm honest about that. The good news, the people who agree with me on it tend to be really sharp. But not everybody does. First thing, let's cover what it means. So the outline is we're going to say the motivation. I just mentioned it briefly. The part that's important is that this model of health financing has existed for 135 years. But it hasn't been the same. It has changed. And I want to go through the history of these changes, because it's important to understand. So then we're going to come to some definition of different types of social health insurance, so we can be very specific when we talk about this. So we don't think we're saying the same thing when we're not. Then I'm going to apply something we call the Shaw framework. It's based on work by one of our colleagues from Harvard, Bill Shaw, and one of our colleagues from the World Bank, Paul Shaw, who wrote a fantastic paper in 2007 when the demand for this was growing, and they started identifying what are the success factors for social health insurance. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual experience between UHC and health insurance based on Ajay's work. Ajay did a fantastic part of a book called Going Universal, which looked at experience from 24 countries that are trying to reach the poor with health services. Ajay's part of it, one of his parts of it is on financing. So what are we learning about experiences, actual country experiences of using insurance to reach the poor? What can we learn from that? And finally, I'm going to give you my bias, which is what experts feel about social health insurance. When I sent this presentation to Professor Reich, he was not happy. He challenged me on every single piece of it. So I have to admit and say, I may be wrong. I don't think I am, but I may be wrong on this one. All right? So, around your table, take a couple of minutes. When you hear the term social health insurance, what comes to mind? Nadim, you seem to have lost the whole thing. They were out, okay, no problem. So, take a couple of minutes, discuss it. I'm going to ask one or two of you to give me a couple of characteristics of what social health insurance might mean to you. So, which table wants to start sharing? When somebody asks you to talk about SHI, social health insurance, what does it mean to you? All right. This is the table that always volunteers.
Because we are first table, number one.
Table number one always volunteers.
Okay, so
Please listen to your colleagues.
for social health insurance, first of all, the name social means that it's social oriented, which means that protections should be cover entire society, entire community of people,
Okay?
regardless of their
Ability to pay.
ability to pay and regardless of their health status. So, and needs.
Okay, thank
So,
you.
solidarity, which
So the
is
first
main-
thought from table one is social health insurance. We need to focus on the first word, social. It's to make sure people who need care, regardless of their ability to pay, have access to services. Right? Sorry to say, traditional social health insurance has absolutely nothing to do with that. But that's what people think it is, which is quite interesting.
It's what it sounds like.
Sounds like, but is that what it is? Can anybody tell me what social health insurance is to you, which is different? So we start from the first table, we go to the last table.
We mentioned payroll deductions.
Ah, so that's a very important part of social health insurance. Payroll deductions. What does that mean? It means there's a labor tax for people whose payroll is known. So it has to be formal sector. Very good.
In Albania, we collected the contribution 1.7 from employees and 1.7 from employers. And the health social insurance means that collected the money and contribute to
Very good. And what percentage of the Albanian population pays?
pays 3.4%.
No. What percentage of the population?
It's about 28.3%.
So only 28% of the
And the
population.
others can make segregation by voluntary segregation.
Voluntary.
Yes.
Excellent. So we're now starting to get a little bit better shape. There has to be a payroll, which means there's a formal sector. Part of that payroll is withheld, whether it's from the employer or employees or some combination. Then there's an interesting part, which Ajay has spoken quite a bit about earlier. The rest, which in the case of Albania is 74% of the population, people can volunteer. We heard about voluntary insurance from Lebanon and elsewhere earlier today, right? Who volunteers? People who need it. Very good. Any other quick reactions to the characteristics of social health insurance?
So it's basically like Medicare in this case.
It's like Medicare. Is that what you said?
I guess it's like
I'm going to get to Medicare in a minute because it's part of the history of the change. Very good. So it's exactly the opposite of what you said at the beginning.
Why?
Because it focuses on the formal sector, which are not the people who need it the most, and it's not made available to those who can't afford it. They have to volunteer into it, which is part of the problem. It sounds like it's a good social program. It's called social health insurance. But by its construction, it's designed to collect money from the formal sector to serve the formal sector. Yes?
what about Germany?
What about Germany?
I'm asking about Germany because
It's a lovely country. They play wonderful football.
yeah, and everyone is covered in Germany.
Yes, I'm going to talk about it because
So
Germany,
it's a different. It's also social health insurance.
it's very social. Can anybody tell me, don't look at your slides, How many years it took Germany to achieve universal health coverage using social health insurance? 127 years. They got there. Very good. So, one of the reasons we do this session, and one of the reasons I've become obsessed with this instrument, is it has coming back from the dead. So this is started in Germany, 1882 or 3. It was part of the Bismarck trying to pull together the country, and it seems to be coming back from the dead. Because as you'll see in a minute, many European countries are trying to move away from it. But Eastern European countries love it. Increasingly, Asian countries and African countries are excited about it.
So,
Is it?
Abdul?
Let me go through the lecture a little bit.
Should they plan also 127 years to UHC?
Maybe. She said, maybe that's a good way to do it. I don't know, but it's a good idea. Anyway, so we're going to clarify some confusion. We're going to give you the diagnostic tool to see is your country, in my view, ready or not ready, using the Bill, Shall, Paul, Shaw framework, and then summarizing best practice from what we could find. So Ajay took you through these things. I'm not going to take you too much into it, but in terms of looking for resources for health that are domestic in nature, you either get money from general revenue, general taxes or general revenue, earmarked revenue. What do we mean by earmarked? That's money that you dedicate for a sector. So when you do social health insurance for health, you earmark the money from payroll to the health sector and only to the health sector. If you do tobacco taxes, sugar taxes, you're earmarking the money to the sector that you want it to go to. Or voluntary or community-based insurance, not mandated as Ajay insists, or out-of-pocket spending. These are the 4 dominant sources of financing. If we want to look at the world and say, okay, what does the world tell us is the best way to go? And we typically look at the wealthiest countries in the world. See, they're the advanced countries, right? You look at OECD, this is my favorite chart. It does not project well. But let me tell you what it says. In dark bars is what the OECD calls social security. By that they mean payroll taxes, labor taxes, what our colleagues from Albania and elsewhere spoke about. In the light blue part, in the dark blue part, it's general I'm confused now. Sorry. In the dark part, it's general revenue. This is not earmarked, not dedicated to health. It's from whatever sources government has. The lighter blue is from labor, payroll taxes, and then out-of-pocket spending, private insurance. If you look at this chart, it will tell you there is no standard model in the world. Some countries dominated by social security, in this case, labor taxes, payroll. Others are dominated by general revenue. So if we want to say, how are the rich countries doing it? This is not going to help us much. It's going to tell us it's whatever countries want. And that's the reality of the health sector. There is not that perfect ideal model anywhere. Which makes it tricky. Because if we're looking at these models to guide us, there is no model that's clear. Sorry? It's not based on the needs of the country. It's based on the history of the country. It's based on historic mistakes in the country. It's fantastic. The US system exists because at some point in time, there was a labor shortage in the US. And companies wanted to attract labor, so they offered health insurance through employers. It wasn't a great thinking group that sat and said, in a global course for the World Bank, and said, what's the best way to do it? It was companies wanting to retain workers. And the way to retain workers was to give them insurance. And it became the dominant form of financing. In Germany, Bismarck wanted to use a way to unite the country. They had some guild insurance, and he decided to grow it that way. Bismarck had nothing to do with the health sector. He was the chancellor. His objective was not health. His objective was unifying the country. So don't think of health systems as somehow thoughtful health people thinking about how things are happening. They tend to be accidents of history. It's a painful thing to accept, but that's the reality of how it works. With one exception, by the way, Soviet system. Not an accident, whether you like it or not. The British system was the Brits wanting to find ways to give social services to people struggling from World War II.
Can you comment on the Soviet? Yes, the Soviet system.
Samashko, which is an extreme form of the UK system because it also has ownership, but it also has an added bad bonus. Money comes from multiple sources. It comes from oblast, from republic, comes from all over the place, so it gets quite confused.
But what do you mean it's not an accident or historical like the others?
So it was a design. It was actually, it was designed.
Yes, but it's a communist system.
You know?
And the two
I'm a World Bank economist, so by definition I don't like communism. But, so if you think of the most successful health systems in the world, low-income countries, they tend to be from socialist countries. Cuba, Sri Lanka, the southern state of Kerala in India. That doesn't mean communism is good for health. It just means these countries got it right. All right, so there's the history. I'm going to take you through some touches of it because it's important to understand. Germany started in 1883, took 127 years. Then there was other European expansion, took also quite a long time. Then there was an East Asia model. I'm going to take you through each one very briefly. Then there came the Latin America systems, American systems, Medicare and Medicaid, which changed the game completely. And we'll talk about why that is the case. Then came Western European reversals. Then came cross-subsidy models. We talked about it yesterday, Colombia and Mexico, where they added, on top of payroll tax contribution, a non-contributory regime. And then there's this new push in Eastern Europe and then in Africa and Asia, which is our focus. This new push for social health insurance. So, Germany, it started because there existed some forms of insurance under guilds. So there were groups of professional organized miners, other industrial workers that put resources together, provided life insurance, provided other services. And the Bismarck model was basically collecting those together and creating a single system, which grew over time. It took 127 years. So it moved mainly from death benefits, which is life insurance, towards health insurance, including unemployment benefits for a while. Other German-speaking countries followed, Sweden followed. It took them a long time to get to where they wanted to get. Next came East Asia. East Asia loved the German model. Japan was the first and did it much faster than the Germans in terms of getting to where they want to get. Korea did it even faster. Korea's interesting point, which people don't realize, the benefit package was very limited. And the out-of-pocket spending is quite high. And so they said, we don't have to provide a very expensive benefit package, and we don't have to make it free for everybody. Let's be pragmatic about it. And by doing so, they cut the amount of time. The expansion was much, much faster. And the South Koreans take a lot of pride in having done what Japan did much, much faster way. There's a question. Is it as good as the Japanese model? I'm not going to try to answer it. I don't think so. But The American variations was very different. So in the 1960s, the US was a hotbed of liberal thinking, and they decided there's a lot of people falling through the cracks. There's an elderly population that's no longer working, and in an employment-based health insurance model, what happens to you when you're no longer employed? You're no longer insured. And it was causing poverty. It was causing people not getting care. So they developed a Medicare system, launched in 1966, and it had an interesting angle. Basically said, while you're working, you contribute. When you retire, you get insurance. And it's a delayed satisfaction in some sense, because while you're working, you're contributing to your own current insurance as well, but you're also paying for your future insurance. There's also a nice bonus in there. The first few generations had a wonderful package. They had not contributed much, but the whole point was to help them. So the first few generations gained quite a bit because they didn't contribute much. But what was interesting about it is it delinked on timeline between when you contribute and when you get the insurance. You contribute now to get insurance after you retire, after a certain age. What's the age? 65? You still pay into it after 65, by the way. You're still taxed with whatever pension you have or income you have. Much lower, obviously. But you're not paying as much as you are when you're fully working. Medicaid was a completely different animal. And it is not the traditional definition of social health insurance because it delinked completely the benefits from the contributions. Medicaid, started in 65, realized there's a lot of people who are indigent, who could not pay for care, but who are not part of the formal sector. So they had no insurance. So this was designed predominantly to redistribute from general revenue to help people who were not part of the formal health sector. So there is absolutely no clear link between contributions and receiving a benefit. But a lot of people call this social health insurance. By the definition that we have in the Green Book, this is not social health insurance. But a lot of people confuse it. There is no link. It is certainly a social program. It's certainly a health insurance program. So semantically, it should be called social health insurance. It's exactly what you defined SHI as. Providing services to people who couldn't afford, who needed it. Latin America, we talked about it yesterday, started this social health insurance German model. There was a growing middle class. That middle class wanted to get more services. So a part of their pension, as in Albania, as in most European countries, part of the revenue came from the employees. There was a contribution. What happened in Latin America, in many of the Latin American countries, people were not happy with the public hospitals. So a parallel system of hospitals developed. Public hospitals, social security hospitals. So you had a social security public hospital, which served those who are in the formal sector, funded by the contributions from payroll, plus some subsidies. Then you have the public hospital, which serves people who are not in the formal sector. So you had a fragmented financing and a fragmented delivery, a parallel system. And some very thoughtful people said, not only is it parallel and fragmented, it is subsidized. So the better off in society are actually not just getting the money they put into the system, but they're getting more subsidy from government to make their health system better. I'm not the one who did this research, I'm just citing the people who said that. Colombia, as I mentioned yesterday, introduced a non-contributory regime. It was the first of a number of countries, Mexico was the next one, and others, that said, how can we bring the non-formal sector into the formal sector? So this was the beginning of what we're calling extended social health insurance. So you build on a base which has payroll-funded insurance for the formal sector. You put on top of it general revenue-funded insurance, and then you put them together. But notice, they never said voluntary. Because as we discussed earlier in Ajay's session, voluntary and health insurance should never exist in the same sentence. Two economists won Nobel Prizes showing that the insurance market fails because people who choose insurance on a voluntary basis, and like in Lebanon, are people who want it and need it. Those who are healthy or think they're going to be healthy rarely choose benefits. So you end up with an increasing contribution, increasing amount of money you have to pay to get into the insurance, and it tends to fail. This is one of the main reasons the US health system before Obamacare had 47 million uninsured Americans and residents. 47 million in the wealthiest country in the world, or one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which spent more on health than any other country in the world. And yet there were 47 million uninsured because they chose not to volunteer into the system, even though they have Medicaid, which covers the poor. So it's the next category that chose not to enter into it. OECD. What was interesting, as Eastern Europe was starting to get excited about labor taxes, established Europe was saying, how the hell do I get out of this mess? And this is real. Western European countries running away from labor taxes. Denmark, Greece, Iceland, Italy, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, all opted out of labor tax social health insurance. It's a good question to ask. Some would say because they felt it's not enough money. Some would say maybe it's making their products more expensive. Whatever the reason, European countries are running out. Even the two dominant countries in Europe that rely on payroll taxes, France and Germany, for years have been trying to find ways to minimize the reliance on payroll taxes. They're looking at broadening their tax base for insurance beyond labor taxes. Now the reason I'm emphasizing this, because it's sold to many of our countries as the wonderful answer. But established countries don't think it's a wonderful answer. And so I'm trying to understand why that is. That so many countries are rushing towards a model which established countries are saying, maybe it's not a great idea.
I don't think it's that hard to understand.
Well, you're smarter than me. So in the same time, Eastern Europe was rushing towards labor taxes because they hate the Shamasco system. Yes, sir.
I think these days the German government is moving back again to the social health insurance, and the reason why they
Social
have
health insurance or labor tax social health insurance?
labor tax social health insurance, and the reason why they have considered moving away from it is the burden, of course, on the employers,
Right.
the companies.
Right.
They wanted to give more, let's say, space, financial space,
Right.
to the companies.
Right.
Now, in the struggle between the parties, it's going back again.
Right. Very good to know. Thank you. So, as Western Europe is trying to get out of more and more reliance, maybe with the exception of Germany, Eastern Europe is rushing towards it, which is a very interesting moment. So, the things we like to look at when we look at insurance models, is it a national program or does it cover segments of the population? When our first colleague here said, it said the whole population. In most places, traditional social health insurance is for the formal sector, which is a segment of the population. They think of it as a building block towards a national program. But it's not started usually as a national program. Is it contributory or non-contributory? This is extremely important. Because a lot of the new programs that everybody's talking about the expansion is not coming from contributory. And I'll give you the data from Ajay's book. Most of the expansion for health insurance for the poor is coming from non-contributory. So you need to keep that in mind. Because the poor typically don't have a formal sector employment, cannot contribute through systems. Maybe the labor market is not well organized to collect from it. Is it earmarked or general revenues? So these are the three dimensions I always want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about a health insurance model. Is it national or part of a country, part of the population? Is it contributory or non-contributory or a combination? Is it earmarked or general revenue? So these are the definitions we are proposing. This is something Ajay, myself, and Bill Shao developed some years ago. We don't know if it's going to solve the big confusion problem, but we're going to give it a try anyway. I tend to not rely on it, because I think it's always better to say exactly what you mean. So if you heard it from me today, I'm always going to say labor tax social health insurance. I'm not going to call it traditional or non-contributory health insurance. I'm not going to call it extended social health insurance. Because I think new terminology may be more confusing. I don't know. But that's the terminology we came up with. TSHI, traditional social health insurance, think of it as the 1880s model. There's a payer-beneficiary link, and the money is earmarked to the health sector. And usually, this is coming through payroll taxes. Extended social health insurance is a mix where you have an existing TSHI, traditional social health insurance, and you want to bring populations that are not covered, and you do so through a non-contributory regime, through government subsidized insurance. But then there's a third category which gets confused quite a bit. This is what I mentioned, Medicaid in the US. There are interest in setting up national insurance systems that have zero links to contribution. They love the purchasing function of the insurance system. They're not as much in love with the labor tax part of it. But they want to move away from supply-side financing. They want insurance, they want purchasing, they want to get away from public financial management rules. But those programs are non-contributory health insurance. They could be called SHI because they're social, but they're not the traditional definition of SHI. Any questions on the definition or on the history? What's the difference between contributory and non-contributory? Contributory, it means the person who's getting the benefit is contributing to pay for through a premium, right? So you either pay through social help, through labor taxes, payroll deduction, or you purchase on a voluntary basis, right? Or you're forced to purchase. Like in the Obamacare, you're supposed to purchase if you're not part of the labor market that forces you. But at least there's a link between you contributing and you getting a card that says, I'm eligible for insurance. Non-contributory means the money comes from a different source, not from the individual who's benefiting. So there's no direct link. Mike.
Some kind of higher level, higher.
We should give Michael a dedicated microphone.
Sorry. Can you, just to add one more definition here, Abdul, explain the difference between a non-contributory health insurance program and the simply old-style Ministry of Health delivery of services. So what's the difference between whether you don't have to pay a premium, the funds all come from the government, and either services provided by the government or where the government reimburses providers but doesn't provide.
Right.
Something like the Japanese system.
Right. And it's not an easy distinction, but the way I define it, and I'm not...
So it's really what makes it insurance.
There's a purchasing function. Oops, sorry. There's a purchasing, when Michael approaches you, you have to back up quickly, so sorry I said that. There is no purchasing function as such. That's the way I define it, but Ajay may want to help you with this one because he is smarter than me.
No. I think that's a very good point, and oftentimes as a challenge. So typically, the way to think about it is the traditional financing where the government provides services is considered to be a supply-side financing. Here, you're moving tax resources to the demand side. So you're making as Abdul said, you're really usually having an organization that has a purchasing role that then purchases services from public, usually, and private providers. So I'm going to, is there somebody from India in the audience? The back. So in India's case, the government-sponsored health insurance scheme, talk about labels, is actually a non-contributory health insurance scheme. It's basically the government providing tax financing, general government revenue financing, to a purchasing agency that then will buy services from public and private providers. So I think the demand side, the fact is the money is flowing based on utilization and coverage of people rather than to the supply side. So that's another way to think about it. Thanks.
Sorry? It's the Ukrainian model.
Yeah. We're trying to implement.
Very good. Which one?
The one that was described.
So it's non-contributory.
Yes. We have a national purchaser. I'm representing National Health Service of Ukraine. Right. There is the money comes from general taxes, and national purchaser purchases services.
So this is the third model.
Armenia had it. Latvia has it.
So a number of countries seem to have moving towards that model. In the traditional definition of SHI, it shouldn't be called an SHI. Who cares? It's a social program. It's a health insurance. And so I just want to make sure people understand which SHI they're talking about. Because if you don't, it confuses the conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry,
we always listen to them.
I may be slow here. I just want to make sure that I get what you're saying. So what makes it an insurance, a non-contributory insurance, is that there is a purchasing agent, that is not the ministry?
No. It's not the purchase. The non-contributory means there's no direct link between people who pay and them receiving the insurance benefit.
Okay, so let me give this example. In Lebanon, the Ministry of Health provides hospitalization for the uninsured, which is funded by tax revenue. So it's considered this?
Non-contributory
okay,
insurance.
thank you.
Absolutely. Sorry? So that's when we go back to Ajay's definition, right? Money always comes from households, whether it's paying general revenue or paying out of your labor taxes. That's the difference. All right. So, one of the interesting pieces of work that came out of the flagship is 2007, Bill Shaw, professor at Harvard, Paul Shaw, lead economist at the World Bank, analyzed examples from around the world which are using labor tax social health insurance, traditional social health insurance. And they came up with a list of enabling success factors. And you may agree or disagree with them. I tend to agree with them. But if you find yourself going towards a labor tax, traditional social health insurance, it would help a lot if you have a large formal sector employment. Because then collecting the payroll taxes are easier. It would help a lot if the wages and salaries are fairly large. It would help a lot if you have low poverty rates, because then you don't have to cover through government revenue. It would help a lot if you have a small family size. Because remember, the person working, insurance covers her whole family, not just her and her husband. It would help a lot if you have an efficiently functioning provider network with cost controls. It would help a lot if you have a strong human resource capacity needed to manage an insurance function, which is not a trivial issue. You have to do actuarial analysis, the ones that Ajay mentioned earlier. You have to have a whole bunch of infrastructure capacity to do this. It would help a lot if you have strong administrative support, banking, accounting, legal. It would help a lot if your government is quite strong. Do you get the message here?
This is not for developing countries.
That is my message, and Michael thinks I'm wrong. At least challenges me on it all the time, which I like about Michael. He always challenges me. So the main message, the way I read the Bill Paul Shaw work, is that what we know works in Germany, in France, and elsewhere, there's a lot of characteristics that don't necessarily exist very strongly in developing countries. So be careful jumping into a system where a lot of the success factors don't exist. Another way of interpreting it, build the success factors. So if you want to go that way, at least try to do it. But it's not easy to build a large formal sector. It's way beyond the health sector. It's not easy to have high wages and salaries. So these are challenging issues. I tried to do some applications of this work. I looked at countries that are wanting to start social health insurance to see to what extent they have the enabling factors. We couldn't find very good data for many of the questions, but we came up with a few. So Benin, in West Africa, wants to do social health insurance, labor taxes. They don't have any of the enabling factors. Cambodia, actually they have a reasonably small family size. The poverty rate has been decreasing. That's still fairly high, and none of the other enabling factors. Yes?
What proportion, what does large formal sector mean?
At this point, we're setting up some, this is not great science.
But 20%, 30%,
Of what?
50% large formal, what does of the population, what does large mean?
So,
what proportion is 20% large,
No.
is 50% large, is 80%?
well, 50% is quite legitimate. Very few countries in the developing world have 50% formal sector. But again, this is not scientific in the sense that we have exact sense of what is the right, but we can tell you what's low and what's reasonably high. Vietnam has more of the conditions. So you start looking at different countries and you find some have some of the conditions, others do not. But unfortunately, I ran a survey this year, SCAD, of 43 low-income and low-middle-income countries. And I found 60% of them are initiating or talking about initiating a labor tax social health insurance. Very few of them have any of these conditions. And that, to me, tells me there's a problem in the development assistance world. Because all the experts, and you'll see some quotations, for the last 15 years have been saying, this may not be the best way to go. Only 2 groups in the world support this. The ILO, and until recently, German Development Assistance. Most of the other agencies have pulled back and said, we're not sure at this point about labor taxes as a good way to do this. But the demand is high, and countries can do whatever countries want to do. That's their right. But our job is to give them whatever best evidence we have. Now, the reason I love having Ajay here is he actually does work, not just talk about it. So one thing they did a few years ago, they actually looked at 24 countries around the world, and they said, how are these countries expanding coverage for the poor? They looked at many dimensions. I'm only going to pull out the elements on financing. And I took a slide from one Ajay's presentation. And systematically, across these countries, they found that the dominant form of coverage, increasing coverage, the dominant form of financing is general revenue. It was not labor taxes. So if you want to look at success examples from developing countries, you're not going to find many TSHI. And yet, I see proposals every day for UHC. And one of the main elements of UHC is to start a labor tax social health insurance.
Are they looking just to shift over to that, or is one way to complement what might be in ESH?
So the interesting part is that when you look at the arguments, you find a lot of interesting arguments. So we did a second follow-up to the SCAD, and we asked, so what's driving this? And here's what we found. I don't know if I have a slide coming up. Actually, if I do, yeah. I'll get to that in a second, if you don't mind. But we did ask exactly, so what's driving this? So, as I said, 61% have either initiated or are considering, and it's even bigger for low-income countries. So 65% of low-income countries are pushing for labor tax, or what we're calling traditional social health insurance. So, we asked why. And we focused on two regions I was interested in, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. Reached out to 8 experts who cover this region, and we asked them. And we started getting consistent answers. 1, misunderstanding of the word coverage. And I tracked that in Asia to Korea, it seems. South Korea told everybody, we've covered everybody with insurance, and that was interpreted as UHC. When you look at the definition of UHC that Ajay showed you this morning, earlier today, and you've seen it in the previous presentations, it doesn't talk about insurance. It talks about effective coverage. And when Ajay talks about pooling, he's not just talking about insurance. There are many ways of pooling resources. The second one, which is actually interesting, they said, we're under pressure to do what the donors are telling us to do, which is this term, this expression, DRM, domestic resource mobilization. So many of the donors are now scared. They are exiting these countries. They said, oh, how are they going to handle without our money? They need to generate their own money. It's also a desire for financial autonomy. So they say, oh, this is a good source of money. There's a small problem with that. There is no evidence that earmark taxes, labor or otherwise, add to the budget. WHO just published a paper in Michael's journal, reviewed all the available literature. And they came out with, remember Ajay's presentation at the end about fiscal space? They said macroeconomy matters a lot. Countries that are growing, they increase spending on health. Reallocation, like Thailand and Vietnam, is wonderful. Countries have decided health is a priority, they've reallocated. Efficiency is good. Then they said, earmark taxes, there's no clear evidence that earmark taxes have. Now, you may ask why. I can tell you a simple answer. If a Ministry of Finance agrees to give you an earmark tax, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to take money out of general revenue. Is it really additional? Are you actually adding more revenue to your country? It looks like, there's an expression in English, it's called fool's gold. It looks sexy, it looks wonderful. We have more money coming to us. But when you look at 2 years down the line, finance, treasury is cutting their budgets in other ways. So the question you have to ask yourself, is labor taxes or earmark taxes a true additional resource? Or is it substituting from general revenue? If it's substituting, maybe it's not. But the one that actually made a lot of sense to me, health insurance is incredibly attractive. People love having insurance. And politicians are first and foremost politicians. So this is a benefit. This is something they could give. I'm sure, Ajay, that's not what's motivating Modi care, is it? So this whole idea of covering, giving people insurance is very attractive. And so people love it. I would love to have insurance because it means I might have choice. I have power. I have say. And that's politically powerful. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I think Ministry of Finance in most countries actually are failed by economists like you. And I begin to wonder, with this kind of insurance that benefits everybody, including the economists in the Ministry of Finance, why are they giving with one hand and taking from another? Because more often than not, anytime economists in the Ministry of Finance, like you clearly stated here, even my country, the same thing, as they are actually giving revenue into insurance or whatever form of healthcare, automatically they deduct.
Not all countries. So there's actually good evidence, Thailand, Vietnam, and a few others, in which Treasury or Ministry of Finance is actually listening to the population and listening to government, and they're saying, we want to prioritize health. And actually they are growing health spending. So there are examples of doing it. To me, if I'm advising a country, I would say, make yourself attractive.
As a health?
As health. So Ajay teaches at a course at Harvard, where they bring the Africa Development Bank, bring ministers of finance to learn a day or two about health. And a couple of years, I got this report from a friend of mine at Harvard. They did a survey of the ministers of finance, and they said, so what would get you to allocate more money to health? The answer I got from my colleagues at Harvard was very interesting. It wasn't that we want to help people and what was interesting about it is that, show me a sector that's efficient and that's serving the needs and that's liked by people. If you show me an efficient, effective sector, I'm much more likely to give more money. By the way, that's exactly what donors want as well. If you can make the argument that you have an effective sector or you're improving the efficiency of your sector, you're much more likely to get more money. Yes. The mic's coming.
Well, two-pronged question. So,
sorry, we already have budget for one. Just kidding.
A lot of the factors you laid out, the circumstances that are helpful to enabling factors for social health insurance, it seems that would also be the true for paying for health through the general revenue. You'd need the similar factors.
No.
Are they different?
Yeah. You do not need a good labor market or a form that helps, but you don't need it. You need a good tax system, right? So it's not exactly the same.
Okay. And then the other question is for the countries that are attracted to the idea of social health insurance and moving towards it, is there enough information in history to see a trend of how much is displaced out of the general revenue budget and so forth?
Yeah. So basically, in the old bank that I used to work for, we always did what's called public expenditure reviews. We would track allocations to each sector over time. And we used to condition our support to countries spending more in the sector. Because we're aware we're bringing money from the outside, and if our money is displacing money, it's not a good idea. Unfortunately, the world has changed, and it was seen that conditionality is a very bad thing, and it was seen that you need to give grants and you need not to worry about it. But what has happened, increasingly and disappointingly, is money is going to health, and people are taking money out of health. Even worse, donors these days condition money on their pet topics. So if you're from a country that believes that primary care is very important, You insist that the money you're giving goes to primary care. What does that do in your national budget? It means national budget is shifted away from primary care. So by pushing on our priorities, we're actually corrupting the domestic health system. Because then you're giving money to less cost-effective services. And then when you exit as a donor, the country is in worse shape. Because they're now not funding primary care. So we have to be very careful. We need to think medium and long term, not just 2 years horizon. And that's a big challenge. All right. Sorry. Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. On the last part that we discussed right now, on the, for example, in Ethiopia, we have a way of doing managing donors that require.
You're good at it.
Yeah, and there's in one of the biggest program we call it basic service delivery. Right. It's like $500 million worth of project, and one of the criteria is that whatever donors contribute, it should be additional to what governments already have.
Absolutely.
If donors bring 10% of the budget as aid or support, then the amount that the Ministry of Finance allocates for basic services should be at least more than 10% the next year. So such kind of management of the donors is important.
And donors love it.
Yes, they love it. And
Ministry of Finance doesn't love it.
Yeah, Ministry of Finance has a challenge, but sometimes they trick the data and they show the donors that, look, this is 20%, not even 10%. But we are auditing the data, and it confirms, in general, it confirms the reality. This is just one idea. My question is on the expansion of the traditional social health insurance or the contributory health insurance in developing countries through like taxing the labor or increased use of DRM, demonstrated resource mobilization. That has its impact, downside impact, making more workers to join the informal sector. Because they don't want to be taxed. If the government takes money out of their small pocket, then they go informally. They look for other works. And this is in developing countries. In developed countries, what we see is the reverse. For example, in the US, the Medicaid. To qualify for the Medicaid, one has to get, for example, $30,000 a year or something, if it's 2%. And if a person works more than $30,000, like next year, if I work $40,000, then I'm going to get out of the Medicaid. So I don't want to work because I don't want to get that 10,000 increment and get out of the Medicaid. So it's the reverse side in developing countries, but in developed countries, it's the opposite one.
Fully agree. And actually, there's tremendous literature in Latin America about the impact of labor taxes on formality. Exactly your point, is that it creates a disincentive for formality. Because if both the employer and the employee is going to pay, they have an incentive to maybe make it under the table, work a certain number of hours, so they're not eligible, and therefore neither one has to pay. It's actually quite a bit of literature on that, and it's not the incentives are real in these things. Very good, thank you. Yes. We always stop for Lebanon.
I have a question for our colleague from Ethiopia. What he said about having to match from the Ministry of Finance, like an allocation that is equivalent to whatever the donor is bringing. So I have a question. Currently in Lebanon, as Ministry of Health, we are taking out a loan of $150 million from the World Bank to offer a basic benefit package of services at the primary care level and some curative services at the hospital level. The Ministry of Finance, it was so hard to convince them to actually agree to this loan. They didn't want to pay for a loan for primary care, for health. They said they don't want it. So we had to give them a lot of reassurances, a lot of data, that this is important to actually get it out and have the parliament accept it. So I'm just thinking out loud here. How would I even, if they don't even want to take out the loan, how can I make them also give me allocation from the budget on top of the loan? I'm just wondering about that.
There's a couple of distinctions you need to keep clear here. A loan from the World Bank for a middle-income country is not the same as a grant. So this is actually government money. So this is the same as actually the government of Lebanon. It's much more towards grants or subsidized loans like IDA loans, which Lebanon has been out of for a long time. So when you borrow from the World Bank or Asia Development Bank, you're actually spending your own money. You're basically leveraging your future to spend now.
I have just one more thing. I'd like to hear from Michael how he challenges you on the idea that social health insurance is actually good.
Over coffee.
Okay.
No, to be fair, I was
That's
joking.
not fair.
I always joke. I always joke with Michael.
If you're going to attack me.
No. I always joke with what Michael does. He's a professional editor. So whenever I send him my slides, he questions everything. And it forces me to think. So this is an ongoing joke about him pushing it. I actually work for him. So in some ways he's my boss. And he's good. But what he was pushing me on, and we can talk about it later, is would you have advised Argentina not to start?
Would you have advised Germany not to start? Would you have advised Japan not to start?
Which is a legitimate question if I were a time traveler. But, and I didn't know back then, in 1883, I wasn't that smart. So maybe I think about it. But it's a good question to think about. And my answer to it is, all I can do is tell countries what I know. But I don't have the ability to force them to do anything they don't want to do, or not to do something they want to do. But as a professional, I have a responsibility to say what I know. And what I know may be wrong. But as you'll see from the quotes I'm going to mention, quite a bit smarter people agree on this list. So, some of the problems with labor tax, social health insurance, TSHI, most conducive factors, the enabling factors we mentioned earlier, and shall, such a hard thing to say, shall, there shall, all shall, do not exist in low and low middle income countries. And that's a challenge. As mentioned by our colleague from Ethiopia, it does push informality in the labor market. We don't like that. We want more we agree with ILO, formality is better. But if this is creating incentive for informality, it's not necessarily good. It can fragment financing and potentially delivery, as the big example from Latin America. It fragmented service delivery. They created two parallel public systems, one for Social Security, one for none. Increases inequality and inefficiency and drive costs up. So basically, we don't like it. And WHO tells us there's really no strong evidence that it increases domestic resources for health. So, as I mentioned from Ajay's work and from the work the WHO just published, TSHI promises whose goal a new source of funding for health, but rarely delivers. And the study just got published. And it's in Michael's journal, so he cannot disagree with it. And the C in UHC is about effective coverage, not insurance coverage. And sometimes people confuse that. I'm just going to leave you with a couple of quotations. I won't read them for you, but these are some people much smarter than me. Bill Savadoff used to be at the Inter-American Development Bank, WHO. He's now a senior fellow in the Center for Global Development, one of the better thinkers in health financing. Adam Wagstaff is a research manager at the World Bank, one of the smartest I know. They've both come out strongly describing the challenges with traditional social health insurance. Yes, ma'am.
So I was wondering, based on your experience and all the data that you've analyzed, what would you recommend to a African government as, you know, a kind of system that would work for the context, for the African context in particular?
So, again, it's very hard to give professional advice to 46 countries with different conditions, and I don't know. Different countries have different tax systems. Different countries have different economic growth. One of the things Ajay has convinced me about is you don't go to a country and give advice before you do something which is called fiscal space analysis, which is actually look at where the potential sources of funding is going to be.
But I mean, a model, like what kind of model?
Oh, no. I am not smart enough. I don't think anybody's smart enough to suggest a model for the world. Because there is no global model. There's a lot of politics, reality checks involved with what works in a country and not works in a country. There's history that you're fighting for or against. There's so many things that goes into designing a model that it's sort of, it would be complete, I would be fired if I come and say this is the model you should do. Even if I know the country well. So I'm not going to go there because it's not my place to do it, nor am I that arrogant to say this is the way to do it.
But you're a technical advisor, right? You should
So-
say that based on the context, based on the fact that most African countries have large informal sectors, low wages, etc. These are the kind of insurance schemes that could work in these kind of sectors. That's what I mean, right? Is there no way to at least give certain options, right, that the country could explore that would fit better than the models that have been used in Europe?
There probably are. I don't feel smart enough to do it. And I'm being honest. I'm being absolutely honest about it. Because one of the things we have to be careful with is not to overrepresent what we know. So I could tell you some of the challenges because it's been studied to death now. So I have the confidence to tell you. But what we do, as I did yesterday, is I give you examples of things that have worked, for example, and say, learn what Colombia did, see if that works for you. Learn what Rwanda did, see if that works for you. Learn what Tanzania did, see if that works for you. I can say that. I'm not going to come in and say, that's the model that should work. And if I do that, if anybody does that, please walk away. Because nobody's that smart. And there's a lot of arrogant people that should not do that. Can we what? Rearrange priorities. Yes, of course. And that's the power of working with your... So one of the things we love, the way we run this course, we used to always ask, and sometimes we would get people from different elements of government and non-government. And hopefully they can, is in a cluster of, in a country cluster, and they can have finance and health and planning and work together and say, if we want to go in this direction, here are the choices we have to make. Here are the trade-offs we have to make. Here are the priorities we can do. To me, that is the consensus-based approach you could do within a country.
Which is the main priority that we can say that works for everybody?
I have no idea. You guys are always trying to get me to say what I don't know. And I have my professor sitting here. I cannot say stuff I don't know.
My question was that I think it seems that there is certain analysis that must be done before we start doing this kind of USA.
Thank you.
And I guess from just what what I understand and hear is that, fiscal space analysis for sure, but then the demography and future trends, and then the burden
which is easy to do.
Right, and then it's burden of disease.
Absolutely.
So I guess my point being that it's certainly health, but it really is beyond health, and it needs to start there, the diagnosis, before...
So I grew up in an institution that would never lend into a sector without doing its homework. We would never go to a country with a loan or a credit unless we've done public expenditure review, we looked at the demographic trends, we looked at epidemiological trends, we did other things. Part of the public expenditure review was dealing with PSM, private sector, public sector management. We needed to understand how do they design budgets, how do they implement budgets, which is way beyond health, right? It's for the whole government. So before we engaged, how do they procure? So there's a lot of diagnostic work. If you want to do your job well, there's a lot of diagnostic work that needs to go. That's not always like it because it takes time. The good news, a lot of that work exists. It's just, it doesn't have to start from scratch.
But despite all this analytical work, we still don't have recommendations.
You're
all of this
you're asking me for a global recommendation. I'm asking it's a country-by-country recommendation. So I've been to Bangladesh 18 times. By the 20th trip, I'll feel comfortable telling them what to do. All right, I've run out of time. I apologize for this, but it was a fun conversation.
There's a little coffee there and little snacks. And I would like to thank Abdo.